Snow fell in heavy silence over Moscow in the winter of 1897, muffling the sound of carriage wheels and church bells alike. In a city already haunted by shadows of revolution and whispers of political unrest, a new story began to spread, one that would unsettle even the most rational minds. It was said that a soldier had returned from the war, his uniform still bearing the marks of service, his posture still that of discipline, his body intact and moving with the assurance of life. But when people tried to look at his face, they recoiled, in horror, for there was nothing there that could be called a face at all. Some claimed that his features had been obliterated by cannon fire, torn away until he was left unrecognizable. Others argued it was not injury, but impossibility, that his skin was smooth, empty, as if the war had stolen his very identity. Families whispered that he had returned as a shell, a vessel animated by something other than flesh and blood. The story slipped through taverns and churches, crossing from the lips of beggars to the ears of noblemen. Moscow, a city well acquainted with tragedy, found itself consumed by a tale that felt less like rumor and more like omen. The church declared it a warning, a punishment for sins that had stained not only the soldier but perhaps the empire itself. Doctors, however, spoke in the clinical language of wounds, nerve damage, and the limitations of 19th century medicine. Yet even they admitted that their accounts were incomplete, that records seemed to vanish, that witnesses contradicted themselves. What should have been a medical case transformed instead into a legend of fear, one that spread more quickly than any official diagnosis could contain. The soldier's family denied him, insisting their son haddied honorably far from home. Neighbors told of seeing him wandering the streets wrapped in bandages, his head bowed but his steps purposeful, as though he carried with him knowledge too dreadful to share. Children cried out that his presence made the lamps flicker, while others whispered that they heard words spoken, though his mouth never moved. What was he? A victim returned from unspeakable trauma? A man cursed by force older than Moscow's cathedrals? Or perhaps not a man at all, but a living specter whose existence blurred the line between life and death? In this investigation, we will trace his origins, follow the testimonies of those who swore they encountered him, and weigh the explanations offered by science, faith, and fear. His story does not offer resolution. It offers a question that still lingers more than a century later. When identity itself is erased, what remains of the human soul? This is the story of the faceless soldier, a figure who walked the snowy streets of 19th century Russia and left behind a trail of silence, mystery, and terror. In the quiet vastness of rural Russia, far from the smoke of factories and the echoing bells of Moscow, the story of the faceless soldier begins. His birthplace was a village so small that it rarely appeared on maps, nestled between stretches of birch forests and rivers that froze solid in winter. Life there moved with the rhythm of the seasons, where survival meant tending to animals, plowing the soil, and enduring the brutal winters with whatever stores could be gathered. It was in such a landscape, isolated, devout, and bound by tradition, that the boy who would later terrify an empire first drew breath. His parents were peasants, unremarkable in their poverty but respected for their endurance. Like most families of the time, they clung tightly to the rituals of the Orthodox Church, believing that every misfortune was a divine test and every blessing a fleeting miracle. Baptized within days of his birth, the boy was given a strong, simple name, one meant to invoke protection rather than grandeur. Neighbors recalled that he seldom cried as an infant, his silence unsettling to mothers who insisted that a healthy child should scream to announce his vitality. Even then, some whispered that his quietness was not innocence, but a sign of something darker, an unnatural calm that carried the weight of ill omens. As he grew, the boy showed little interest in the rowdy games of other children. While others chased each other across fields or carved wooden toys, he would sit near the family's small hut, staring into puddles or polishing fragments of broken glass as though fascinated by the reflections. Villagers joked that he loved mirrors, more than people, but behind their laughter was unease. To them, mirrors were not mere objects but thresholds, symbols that could reveal not just one's appearance, but also one's soul. For a child to be so fixated on them felt wrong, even dangerous. At church he was dutiful but peculiar. He recited prayers with precision, yet never crossed himself at the right moments, as though he were imitating faith rather than feeling it. The priest noted his sharp memory, his ability to repeat sermons word for word, but he also described the boy's eyes as too still, too knowing. Stories circulated of him standing in the candle-lit nave long after services ended, watching the flickering flames with an expression that some took for reverence, others for something harder to name. Despite his strangeness, the boy grew into a capable young man. His hands, calloused from labor, were strong enough to lift sacks of grain, and his back was broad from cutting timber. He did not complain of work, nor did he seek praise. Yet there remained a hollowness in him, as though each task he performed was mechanical rather than meaningful. To his parents, this made him reliable. To his neighbors, it made him unsettling. Some said he was blessed with discipline. Others whispered that he was incapable of joy. When the Tsar's army swept through the countryside in search of recruits, the boy was conscripted without resistance. Military officials described him in their records with cold efficiency. Obedient, quiet, unremarkable. He accepted commands without question, stood in formation without wavering, and carried his weapon as though it were an extension of himself. Yet among his fellow conscripts, rumors took root. Some claimed he never slept, or that his breathing was so faint at night they feared he was dead. Others said he polished his bayonet until it gleamed like a mirror, staring into their reflection, for hours as though searching for a face he could not quite recognize. Letters from officers reveal conflicting impressions. One praised his reliability, writing that he was a soldier who never falters. Another, more unsettled, wrote that he seemed untouched by camaraderie or fear, as though he marches not with us but beside us, belonging to no one. In a world where loyalty and brotherhood were prized, his isolation stood out like a shadow on white snow. Back in his village, stories deepened the mystery. Some claimed that before leaving for war, he visited the cemetery alone at night, kneeling before unmarked graves as though speaking to the nameless dead. Others swore that his mother wept, not because she feared losing him, but because she believed he had never truly belonged to her. That he was borrowed, not born, a child destined for something, neither human nor divine. Such tales, impossible to verify, nevertheless shaped the perception of the man long before he became a legend. Religion and superstition colored every interpretation of his life. To devout neighbors, his silence was a curse, a mark of divine punishment visited upon his family. They spoke of children born with the evil eye, destined to bring ruin to their households. Skeptics, however, argued that he was simply withdrawn, perhaps traumatized by poverty or an early unspoken tragedy. To them, his fascination with mirrors and fire was less a sign of damnation than an attempt to understand himself in a world that gave him little room to speak. The village's conflicting views foreshadowed the greater debates that would later consume Moscow. Was he innocent, shaped by forces beyond his control, or was there something within him that set him apart from birth? Was his silence a symptom of a troubled mind, or was it the stillness of a soul already preparing for the unspeakable horrors of war? When he finally left home, the parting was without ceremony. His father clasped his hand once, briefly. His mother gave him a small wooden cross to wear around his neck, though some claim he never kept it. Neighbors watched him march away with other conscripts, noting how he neither turned back nor waved farewell. It was as if he had already severed the threads that bound him to his village. In time, the village would remember him less as a boy who once tilled their fields and more as a harbinger of the story that would soon terrify the nation. The army hardened him further, stripping away what little softness his youth had left. He endured drills, hunger, and frost without complaint. While other men cursed or joked to ease their burdens, he remained silent, a figure of stone among shifting voices. His superiors took this as discipline, but his comrades saw something colder, a void where fear and anger should have been. Soldiers described how, during skirmishes, he advanced with a calm that unnerved even the enemy, as though bullets and screams barely reached him. One tale, told by a fellow recruit, described a night when the unit was ordered to hold a trench under relentless artillery fire. As men cowered and prayed, the silent soldier sat unmoving, eyes fixed on the explosions, his expression unreadable. When dawn came, he stood and brushed dirt from his uniform, untouched by shrapnel, untouched by terror. To some, he was a model of bravery. To others, he seemed less alive than possessed, as though guided by an unseen hand. Psychologists today might read these accounts as early signs of dissociation, the mind detaching from unbearable reality. But to the men who served beside him, explanations of science mattered little. They felt in their bones that he was different, and difference in the crucible of war often breeds fear. The mirror obsession never left him. Soldiers noticed he carried a small shard of polished metal, using it not for shaving, but for staring. Some swore he whispered to it, others that he held it to the moonlight as though hoping it would reveal something hidden. When asked why, he gave no answer. When pressed, he simply turned the shard until the questioner saw his own distorted reflection, and the conversation ended there. Such behaviors made him both a source of unease and of dark fascination. In campfire gossip, he became a figure of speculation. Was he touched by madness? Was he cursed by God? Or had he glimpsed something on the battlefield that robbed him of ordinary humanity? None could say, and he himself offered no words. Back home, his family lived in uneasy silence. His parents received no letters, though most conscripts wrote at least once. When news arrived of his survival, it came not from him but from officers' reports. His mother aged quickly, eyes hollowed as though she bore a secret she could not share. Some said she dreamed of him standing at her door, faceless even then, and woke in terror, night after night. Whether such dreams were mere imagination or some premonition remains unknowable. The origins of the faceless soldier are thus layered in contradiction. He was, by the records of the state, a dutiful son of Russia, conscripted, obedient, unremarkable. Yet to those who knew him, he was a boy who preferred mirrors to games, silence to song, and solitude to community. He was a man whose calm seemed less like discipline and more like absence, whose bravery looked too much like indifference. Innocent child or disturbed soul, victim of poverty or bearer of curse, his beginnings refused to settle into clarity. And perhaps that is why his later return to Moscow struck so deeply. If he had been ordinary, his facelessness might have been explained as tragedy alone. But because he carried from childhood the aura of strangeness, his transformation became not merely an injury, but a symbol, a disappearance of identity that had been whispered about since his earliest days. For those who knew the boy, the faceless soldier was not a surprise. He was the inevitable culmination of a life already shaped by silence and shadows. As we move from his village origins to the moment of his return, one question remains at the center of his story. Was he always destined to become faceless, or did the horrors of war strip away what little humanity he once possessed? The truth, like the reflection in a shattered mirror, seems fractured, each piece revealing part of the image but never the whole. Moscow in the final years of the 19th century was a city of contradiction. Its boulevards carried the grandeur of empire, ornate facades, gilded domes, and the glow of gas lamps illuminating fashionable streets. While only a few alleys away, poverty pressed against every wall, with beggars huddled in doorways and disease lingering in cramped tenements. It was a city accustomed to tragedy, yet unprepared for the kind of fear that would spread when the faceless soldier returned. His reappearance in late 1897 was not heralded by fanfare or official recognition, but by whispers that first rose in the poorest districts before winding their way toward the salons of the wealthy. The first reported sighting was by a night watchman stationed near the Yaouza River. He described a tall figure moving awkwardly, his head swathed entirely in bandages, his uniform torn but still bearing the Tsar's insignia. The watchman said he felt a sudden chill, though the night was no colder than any other. When called out, asking the stranger to identify himself, the figure paused but offered no words. Only a sound, low and muffled, that the watchman could not place as human speech. Some said it was the rasp of an injured throat. Others insisted it was closer to the hum of a wind passing through hollow pipes. The watchman, unnerved, allowed him to pass. By morning, the story had spread among local workers. A soldier, maimed beyond recognition, had returned to Moscow. As more sightings followed, details accumulated like fragments of a broken picture. He was said to move slowly, shoulders hunched, yet with a deliberate certainty, as though each step followed an invisible path only he could perceive. Some swore his eyes glowed faintly behind the bandages, though others claimed there were no eyes at all, just smooth, unbroken skin hidden beneath the wrappings. Women who glimpsed him crossing courtyards reported fainting spells, overcome not by gore but by a sense that something essential was missing, that he was not incomplete but wholly other. Inevitably, he found his way back to the home where he had been born. His parents lived in a modest wooden house at the city's edge, having moved there from their village when opportunities for seasonal work arose. Neighbors recounted the scene, a figure at the doorway, his head tilted downward, hands trembling as though reaching for familiarity. His mother, they said, collapsed in sobs, crying out that her son was dead, that this man could not be him. His father barred the threshold, refusing entry, declaring in a voice quivering with fear that the soldier they had raised had perished honorably in battle. "Whoever you are," he is remembered to have said, "you carry his body, but not his soul." The figure reportedly turned without protest and walked into the snow, leaving footprints that some swore melted before they could be traced. This rejection only deepened the mystery. If his own family denied him, then who was he? To some, it was proof that he was an imposter, a deserter disguising himself with bandages. To others, it was confirmation of something supernatural, that his parents recognized not their child, but an intruder wearing human flesh like a mask. The paradox of his existence, at once bodily and inhuman, spread through Moscow like a contagion. Doctors were the first to attempt rational explanation. One physician, summoned by the city police after complaints of public disturbance, described him clinically: a male of approximately 30 years, height average, bearing extensive cranial injury. Bandages concealed total disfigurement. Speech impaired, though some guttural noises produced. Gait functional, signs of sustained trauma, yet subject ambulates independently. Yet the report was strangely incomplete. No sketches were attached, no detailed notes of examination. When questioned further, the physician admitted he had not removed the bandages entirely, claiming the soldier resisted. Others whispered the doctor himself recoiled when he tried. Another report filed weeks later described the same soldier as exhibiting no discernible features. The doctor wrote, "The patient's skin is smooth where eyes, nose, and mouth ought to be. No orifice is visible. Nevertheless, the subject breathes, produces sound, and consumes liquid when administered carefully." Such a statement defied all logic, straddling the line between medical testimony and Gothic fiction. When skeptics later sought to verify the file, they found it missing from official archives, as though it had never existed. Only references in private letters remained, tantalizing but unverifiable. Folklore thrived in the gaps left by disappearing records. Street vendors claimed the soldier was a revenant, returned from the battlefield not as a man but as a vessel for the unburied dead. A laundress swore she saw him near the river, kneeling over the water, and when she dared look closer, his reflection did not appear at all. A cab driver told of a passenger wrapped in bandages who paid with coins so old they bore the face of a czar long dead, and when the driver looked back after dropping him off, the carriage was empty though the seat was still wet with melted snow. Such stories blurred fact and imagination, yet each added weight to his legend. The police attempted to suppress the rumors, labeling them hysteria. Officers reported detaining the soldier several times, but curiously, no arrest records remain. Some accounts say he was always released within hours, others that he simply vanished from locked cells without explanation. One sergeant wrote privately in his diary, "We do not hold him, he holds us." Psychological interpretations emerged as well. Students of medicine argued he might be suffering from extreme trauma, both physical and mental. They suggested his facelessness was a metaphor, villagers and witnesses projecting horror onto a man too disfigured to look upon. "The absence of features," one student wrote, "is a collective delusion born of revulsion. He has a face, surely, but it is one no one wishes to recognize. This rational explanation appealed to academics, yet failed to explain the vanished documents, the contradictions in medical notes, and the strange testimonies of those who swore his presence bent reality itself. Religion offered its own answers. Priests declared the faceless soldier a sign of divine punishment, his identity erased by God for sins unspoken. Some suggested he had committed atrocities in war, burning villages, desecrating churches, killing innocents, and thus returned stripped of the very image of man. Others, more mystical, claimed he was not punished, but chosen, transformed, into Fur, a vessel of suffering meant to remind Russia of its spiritual decay. Pilgrims began to seek him, hoping to glimpse the man who embodied God's wrath, or perhaps God's sorrow. Neighbors, meanwhile, lived in terror. Some claimed their lamps flickered when he passed. Others said animals refused to go near him, dogs howling as though at a phantom. Children spoke of dreams in which he stood at their bedsides, silent, faceless, watching until they awoke screaming. Parents locked doors, yet still footprints appeared in courtyards leading nowhere. For ordinary Muscovites, he was not just a rumor, but an intrusion, a presence that could not be contained. And yet, amidst the fear, there were those who felt pity. A seamstress recalled giving him bread, which he accepted with trembling hands, bowing his head as if in gratitude. An old beggar claimed the soldier placed a coin in his cup, though the beggar insisted he felt no fingers, only the cold press of metal. These small acts of humanity complicated the story. Was he a monster, or a man reduced to misery by the cruelty of war? The duality of Heist's existence, victim or apparition, mutilated man or supernatural anomaly, reflected broader anxieties of the time. Russia stood on the brink of upheaval. Revolution loomed, the empire's power faltered, and belief in both church and state wavered. The faceless soldier became a mirror of the nation itself, stripped of identity, staggering between survival and collapse. His very being raised the question no authority could answer. What remains of a man when his face, the very seat of recognition, is gone? By the end of 1897, his legend had crystallized. To some, he was proof of medical tragedy, a survivor too broken to bear. To others, he was a curse walking among them, faceless not because of injury, but because he was never truly human. Moscow divided itself into believers and skeptics, each camp clinging to explanations that revealed more about themselves than about the soldier. Yet the contradictions persisted. The bandaged figure was seen in multiple districts on the same night, suggesting either exaggeration or impossibility. Reports described him vanishing down alleys where no exit existed. A police file supposedly included a sketch, an oval head with no features, only the impression of blankness. But that page, too, disappeared. The more one sought to prove his existence, the more evidence seemed to dissolve, as though he resisted being captured by history, and so the central tension grew sharper. Was this man merely disfigured, hidden beneath cloth to shield the world from his injuries? Or was there truly nothing beneath? No eyes, no mouth, no nose. An erasure of identity that defied anatomy itself. The truth hovered like frost in the air, visible, chilling, yet untouchable. The return of the faceless soldier struck Moscow like a blow not just to the senses, but to the very foundations of belief. In a city where progress and tradition collided daily, where medical schools trained new physicians in anatomy, while churches still rang bells at every hour, his existence became a battlefield for explanations. Tosom, he was living proof of the fragility of flesh, a survivor of catastrophic injury who lingered only because human will is stubborn. To others, he was a sign from heaven or perhaps from hell, sent to remind a wavering empire of its sins. In him, science and superstition met face to face, though ironically he possessed no face at all. Doctors were the first to attempt a rational interpretation. Moscow boasted some of the empire's most ambitious medical men, many trained in Paris, or Berlin, who returned eager to apply European methods to Russian cases. They saw in the soldier a puzzle of anatomy and survival. Some argued his condition was the result of severe burns, perhaps from an explosion on the battlefield. Skin grafts in the 19th century were crude at best. Infections ravaged more than they healed, and soldiers often lived with disfigurements that blurred the line between human and grotesque. A faceless survivor, they insisted, was tragic, but not supernatural. Others believed nerve damage explained his silence and distorted movements. If shrapnel or flame had destroyed the delicate architecture of his features, if scar tissue had sealed over the orifices through which men see and speak, then his blankness could be understood through biology. One physician wrote in his notes, later, leaked but never officially published, "We mistake horror for impossibility. The man breathes, therefore he has means unseen. The man makes sound, therefore he has organs concealed. His suffering is extraordinary but not miraculous. Let us not surrender to fear where flesh alone suffices." Yet even as they argued for medical explanations, these same physicians confessed unease. Why did records vanish from archives? Why did patients and nurses who claimed to see him describe not scars but absence, skin smooth and featureless, as if nature had erased its own work? Why did those who stood too near him complain of headaches, chills, or fainting spells, as though his body radiated not merely deformity, but some invisible force? Religion, meanwhile, gave voice to those for whom science's calm language could not suffice. Priests in black robes thundered from pulpits that the faceless soldier was a living omen, a man stripped of the divine image of God. To be faceless, one sermon declared, is to be soulless. God breathes his likeness into every child. If the likeness is gone, so too is the soul. Believers filled the churches, whispering that Russia itself had sinned, that corruption, decadence, and the blood spilled on battlefields had summoned this figure as punishment. Some feared he was a messenger of apocalypse, an angel whose face had been removed because mortals could not endure its true form. Ordinary Muscovites did not need sermons to convince them. They saw the evidence in their daily lives. Shopkeepers swore that shadows bent unnaturally when he walked past, stretching not with the lamps but against them. Bakers complained their dough spoiled on days he passed their windows. A midwife claimed a child was stillborn the very night she glimpsed him in an alley. These accounts, impossible to prove yet impossible to silence, spread faster than any physician's lecture. Fear thrives not on logic, but on whispers. Psychologists of the era, though few in number and often dismissed by both clergy and traditional doctors, offered a different lens. They argued the soldier was not just mutilated in body, but in mind. Trauma, they suggested, had fractured his identity. When the face is destroyed, one lecturer mused at a gathering of students, the self is destroyed with it. He has not merely lost features. He has lost the mirror through which we know ourselves. He walks faceless because he feels faceless. This interpretation resonated with intellectuals who saw in the soldier not a demon, but a victim, his condition an extreme case of what would later be called dissociation or post-traumatic stress. Yet even these psychologists faced challenges. If his facelessness was symbolic, why did so many report the same impossible details? Why did strangers, unconnected and uneducated, describe smooth skin where eyes should have been? Was it collective hysteria? Or was there something stranger, something that defied both medicine and psychology, forcing itself into the minds of those who witnessed him? The debates reached the newspapers, though carefully, for censorship loomed over every story in Imperial Russia. One publication dared to print an article titled "The Man Without a Face," describing him as a medical marvel. The piece was seized within hours, the editor fined, the issue recalled. Another paper, more daring, published a religious interpretation, declaring the soldier a sign of divine wrath. That edition sold out in minutes, but the editor, too, found himself questioned by authorities. The empire wanted neither superstition nor science to inflame the people. Silence, as always, was safer, but silence could not contain him. In taverns, arguments erupted between skeptics and believers. Some insisted he was merely a soldier scarred by fire, covered in bandages to protect tender skin. Others spat that such explanations were cowardly, that anyone who had truly seen him knew no wound could look like that. "I would rather see a corpse," one man declared, "than that living emptiness." The divide was not just about the soldier, it was about the very soul of Russia, torn between progress and tradition, reason and faith. The clash between science and superstition did not remain abstract. It shaped the way people treated him. Physicians sought to confine him, chastity, and perhaps heal him, though none succeeded. Priests sought to banish him, sprinkling holy water, where he walked, chanting prayers in alleys he frequented. Citizens locked their doors, some clutching crosses, others knives, none certain what they faced. And through it all, the soldier himself remained silent, a figure neither confirming nor denying any interpretation, walking calmly as the world around him argued. One story illustrates the tension with painful clarity. A group of medical students, emboldened by curiosity, cornered him one evening near a marketplace. They begged him to allow an examination, promising care, perhaps even surgery. He stood unmoving. Finally, one student, overcome by frustration, reached to pull away a strip of his bandage. At that moment, the student collapsed, convulsing, froth at his lips. He survived but awoke with no memory of what he'd seen, only a terror he could not articulate. His fellows swore they glimpsed nothing beneath the bandage, only a void, darker than skin, darker than shadow. Was it hallucination born of fear, or a glimpse into something science could not name? The question lingered long after, feeding both medical journals and whispered prayers. For every rational claim, there was a counterclaim steeped in the uncanny. When doctors said Burns explained his smoothness, believers asked why his skin bore no scars, no seams, no marks of injury. When priests claimed he was soulless, skeptics asked how he could perform small kindnesses, giving bread or coins. When psychologists insisted his facelessness was a metaphor, ordinary citizens asked why they felt cold wind when he passed, even in summer. Each answer dissolved against its opposite, leaving only contradiction. In time, the faceless soldier became less a man than a question. Was the world governed by laws of flesh and physics, or by forces unseen? Could a single figure embody both, the tragedy of war's disfigurement and the terror of supernatural omen? To confront him was to confront one's own beliefs, to decide whether the universe was rational or haunted. And because no resolution ever came, the debate grew louder, sharper, until it seemed the soldier carried not just his own mystery, but the weight of Russia's uncertainty itself. Perhaps the most chilling detail is this: neither side could claim victory. The doctors never cured him, the priests never banished him, the psychologists never explained him. He continued to walk, silent, wrapped in bandages, impervious to both reason and ritual. And in his silence lay the cruelest irony. He embodied the battle between science and superstition, yet he himself offered no answer, no explanation, no end. If the faceless soldier had been confined to rumor alone, his story might have faded into the yellowed margins of forgotten newspapers. But what anchored him in memory, what transformed him from whispered legend to enduring nightmare, were the testimonies, fragments from ordinary people who swore they encountered him not as a story, but as a presence. These accounts, scattered across police notes, private diaries, and hushed conversations, are contradictory, often impossible, yet united by one detail: none who met him walked away unchanged. The first account came from a washerwoman on the outskirts of Moscow. She claimed she was returning home one winter night when she saw a man standing beneath a broken gaslight, his body still but his bandaged head tilted toward her. At first she thought him injured, perhaps a beggar in need of help. But as she drew closer, she realized the bandages were not stained or worn. They were clean, too clean, as if they were not cloth but part of him. She tried to speak, to ask if he needed assistance, but before she could utter a word, she felt something press into her mind. Go home. The voice was not heard but felt, vibrating inside her chest. Terrified, she obeyed. Later, she confessed she had no memory of walking, only of arriving home breathless, her laundry basket spilled behind her. Her testimony would have been dismissed as the fevered fancy of a tired woman, had it not been echoed by others. A cobbler on Arbat Street swore that when the faceless soldier passed his shop, every mirror in the room splintered simultaneously, though no object had touched them. A seamstress described hearing her own thoughts repeated back to her in a distorted whisper when she met his gaze, or rather, the blank space where a gaze should have been. She fainted, and when revived, insisted he had stolen some part of her, though she could not explain what. The most chilling account came from a landlady in a tenement near the river. She claimed the soldier visited one of her tenants, a family of 4. Neighbors heard nothing unusual that evening, yet the next morning the apartment was silent. When the landlady entered, she found the rooms abandoned, plates of food still warm, chairs pulled back from the table, a candle half burnt beside an open Bible. But the family was gone. No luggage was missing, no valuables taken. Authorities dismissed it as a runaway case, but the landlady swore the faceless soldier had climbed the stairs the night before and left silently. The family was never found. Police reports confirmed disturbances in several districts during the winter of 1897 into early 1898. Yet when modern researchers attempted to examine the archives, they found files missing, entire cases erased. Only fragments remained, notes describing unsettling encounters, unprovable anomalies, citizens distressed without cause. One surviving document described a man heavily bandaged, wandering insolence, provoking hysteria in multiple witnesses. Another noted cryptically, presence induces physiological responses beyond explanation. But each of these files trails into emptiness, as if hands deliberately stripped them from record. Some who claimed encounters spoke of empathy rather than fear. A widow described meeting Heman a fog-draped morning. She had lost her son in the same war from which the soldier returned. When she saw him, she expected terror. Instead, she felt a crushing sorrow descend upon her, as if he carried not only his own grief but hers as well. "He knew my pain," she whispered to a priest days later. Without a word, he took it into himself. When he left, I felt hollow, as if something inside me had been stolen yet also relieved, as though my burden had found another host. Such testimonies suggest not horror, but unbearable empathy, a transfer of grief that both terrified and comforted. Was he a thief of souls, or a vessel absorbing the anguish of others? Skeptics, of course, had explanations. Physicians claimed hysteria was contagious. One witness's fear could infect another's imagination. Psychologists argued that in a society primed for superstition, any unexplained figure became a mirror for anxiety. To see the faceless soldier was to see one's own dread projected back, like a nightmare reflected in waking life, and yet these rational explanations falter against the consistency of details. How did so many people, from washerwomen to policemen, from landladies to grieving widows, describe the same impossibilities, mirrors shattering, thoughts pressed into the mind, food left warm on a table where no dinners remained? In some accounts, encounters bordered on the miraculous. A sick child, bedridden and feverish, claimed the faceless soldier appeared at his bedside, placed a wrapped hand upon his chest, and whispered without sound. By morning, the fever had broken. The family hailed it as divine intervention, though doctors scoffed that illness often resolves overnight. Yet when asked to describe the visitor, the child insisted, "He had no face, but he looked at me." Not all testimonies ended with survival. One account, now lost but reconstructed from oral memory, described a man who followed the soldier, determined to expose him as fraud or phantom. Days later, the man was found wandering barefoot in the snow, his eyes clouded, his mouth unable to form words. He lived, but spoke no more, as though facelessness had been transferred to his soul. As these stories spread, the city itself seemed to bend around the soldier. Districts where he was rumored to appear emptied after dark. Merchants refused to rent rooms to bandaged lodgers. Mothers warned children not to stare into shadows. The authorities issued no proclamations, yet unofficially, police were instructed not to pursue him, only to disperse crowds that gathered in his wake. The state's silence only deepened the mystery. The most unsettling testimonies came not from the poor or the credulous, but from officials themselves. One policeman confessed, privately, that when the soldier passed, the street lamps dimmed though their oil was full. Another admitted that this pocket watch stopped at the precise moment he looked upon the bandaged head. Both reports vanished from archives, yet were preserved in diaries smuggled to later generations. Their authenticity cannot be proven, but the consistency of their fear cannot be denied. And yet, amidst these haunting stories, one detail stands above all: the soldier never harmed. anyone directly. He did not attack, did not steal, did not shout. He walked silently, sometimes pausing, sometimes vanishing. The terror he inspired was not in actions, but in presence, as if high existence itself was a crime against order. Whether absorbing grief, bending shadows, or erasing families, he left behind no trace but silence. In this paradox, harmless yet devastating, his legend deepened. For believers, testimonies proved he was no ordinary man but a supernatural omen, perhaps divine punishment or demonic curse. For skeptics, they illustrated the power of fear to warp perception, hysteria spreading like frost across a city already burdened with poverty and unrest. But for those who encountered him, explanations mattered little. What they remembered was not the logic or theology of it, but the sensation. A pressure in the chest, a silence in the mind, a certainty that the world had shifted around them. And so, the faceless soldier lived not only in Moscow's streets but in its stories. Each testimony became another thread in the tapestry, some woven with terror, others with sorrow, all resisting certainty. He was a phantom to some, a patient to others, an angel or demon depending on the lens. But he was never forgotten. His presence clung to those who saw him, as if their lives had been branded by an encounter that defied explanation. Perhaps the truest testimony comes not from any single account, but from their contradictions. In the cacophony of voices, fearful washerwomen, skeptical doctors, grieving widows, and silent policemen, what emerges is not clarity, but complexity. The faceless soldier remains both undeniable and unprovable, a figure balanced perfectly between existence and myth, and in that balance lies his power. For to this day, those who study his story must confront the same question that haunted Moscow in 1897. Were these testimonies the echoes of mass hysteria or fragments of truth glimpsed through the veil of terror? By the dawn of the 20th century, the faceless soldier was no longer just a rumor haunting Moscow's snowy streets. He had become a story, and stories, unlike men, do not die easily. The man who had wandered silently through alleys and marketplaces now lived in whispers exchanged between neighbors, in scribbled notes tucked into diaries, in fragments of newspaper clippings hidden away by those afraid to throw them out. He was Bython, already shifting from witness testimony into folklore. And with that transformation came theories, each one attempting to solve a riddle that seemed deliberately unsolvable. The first theory was pragmatic, almost disappointingly so. Some believed the faceless soldier was simply an imposter. According to this version, he was not a miraculous survivor at all, but a deserter who had returned from war disfigured and ashamed. Unable to face his family, he wrapped himself in bandages and cultivated mystery as a way to shield his broken self from ridicule. His supposed supernatural aura was nothing more than the unease people naturally feel in the presence of disfigurement, a discomfort magnified by gossip. This interpretation was embraced by skeptics who insisted that Russia, a land already rife with superstition, had exaggerated an unfortunate man into a myth. But even this theory raised questions. Why then were police records missing, testimonies silenced, and witnesses so consistent in their description of impossibilities? An imposter may deceive a handful, but could he deceive an entire city? Others leaned toward darker explanations. Some claimed he was not an imposter, but a revenant, a body returned from death itself. The late 19th century was fertile soil for such beliefs. Tales of vampires, restless spirits, and walking corpses circulated widely in both rural villages and the teeming heart of Moscow. To believe in the faceless soldier as a revenant was to accept that death does not always bind tightly, that sometimes the grave loosens its grip and something not entirely human walks back among the living. His facelessness in this reading was not disfigurement but a sign of his unnatural rebirth, his soul erased or withheld, leaving only a blank husk. If true, he was not merely a warning, but a curse, a reminder that wars fill not only graveyards, but the spaces between them. Psychologists, who were beginning to gain foothold in European thought at the time, offered their own interpretations. They argued the faceless soldier was one of the earliest public examples of identity collapse, what modern readers might call dissociation or post-traumatic stress disorder. In this view, his facelessness was metaphorical as much as physical, a man so shattered by trauma that he had lost the sense of self altogether. His silent wandering, his refusal to be recognized, his effect on others, all were symptoms of Eamon whose mind had ruptured under the weight of unspeakable violence. He has lost the mirror, one early psychologist wrote, and so he has lost the man. This theory appealed to intellectuals who sought rational anchors, yet it could not explain the strange phenomena reported in his wake: mirrors shattering, clocks stopping, families vanishing. Trauma may explain silence, but does it explain impossibility? Rumors circulated, too, of institutional confinement. Whispers suggested he had been taken to a Moscow asylum. Some named the Preobrazhenskaya, others the secretive wards beneath the I. Serbsky Institute. There, it was said, he remained 4 years, studied in secret by doctors who alternately feared and coveted the knowledge his body held. Some versions claim he died there, his corpse hidden from the public. Others insist he escaped, his silence too strong even for locked doors. No official record has ever surfaced, though some asylum rosters from that era are mysteriously incomplete, whole pages torn from ledgers. To this day, no grave, no death certificate, no burial site has been proven to belong to him. But as the decades turned, the theories grew stranger still. Occultists, drawn to Russia in waves of mystical fervor at the turn of the century, claimed he was the result of an experiment, an unholy marriage of orthodox ritual and forbidden rites drawn from apocryphal texts. Secret sects, they whispered, sought to strip a man of identity, to create a vessel emptied of soul, a shell that could house forces beyond human comprehension. The faceless soldier, in this telling, was not a victim of war, but of ritual, his condition, deliberately crafted to test the boundaries of flesh and spirit. Was he a failed experiment, or a successful one? The occultists never agreed, but they agreed on one thing: he was no accident. Later decades embellished the legend further. In the chaos following the Russian Revolution, stories claimed Bolshevik agents found his body hidden in an aristocrat's cellar, preserved in jars of chemicals. Others insisted he had fought alongside the Red Army, his blank visage concealed beneath wrappings, striking terror into enemies who thought they battled not a man, but a ghost. During the Second World War, the myth resurfaced again. Some Soviet soldiers whispered of a faceless comrade who appeared in the trenches only to vanish when the gunfire ceased. Whether these were new sightings or recycled folklore cannot be known, but the persistence of his story, through upheaval and bloodshed, is telling. A society fractured by violence needs symbols for its fears, and the faceless soldier provided one. Identity lost, humanity erased, survival without recognition. Among ordinary people, theories became folk stories. Some mothers warned their children not to wander after dark, lest the faceless soldier steal their faces in exchange for his own. Others claimed he was a protector of orphans, absorbing grief so they might live lighter lives. In rural villages, he became a boogeyman. In intellectual salons, a metaphor. Each retelling adjusted him to the needs of the teller. Was he evil or pitiful, a monster or a martyr? The ambiguity made him endlessly adaptable, a blank canvas, ironically fitting for a man without a face. Scholars of folklore argue that this very blankness explains his endurance. Legends usually attach to striking images: a witch with claws, a wolf that speaks, a saint with a halo. But the faceless soldier's image was absence itself. To imagine him was to imagine nothing, and in that nothingness people could project their deepest anxieties. The worker feared becoming invisible to the state. The soldier feared losing his humanity in battle. The priest feared divine wrath. The intellectual feared madness. All could see themselves in his emptiness. He was not one myth, but many. Some myths, however, grew more sinister. In underground circles, rumors spread that secret societies sought to replicate his condition. Whispered accounts describe rituals in which men gazed into mirrors until their reflections vanished, or bound themselves in silence until their voices withered. These stories, largely unverified, suggest that some did not see the faceless soldier as a curse but as a threshold, proof that human identity could be undone and remade. Such interpretations border on the grotesque, yet they reveal how a legend mutates when touched by obsession. For those hungry for power, the soldier was not tragedy, but blueprint. Even today, researchers and enthusiasts debate his true nature. Was he a scarred veteran, exaggerated by gossip? A revenant born of war's cruelty? A psychiatric case misunderstood by his age? Or was he truly something beyond? An experiment, a spirit, an omen wrapped in bandages? Each theory has defenders and detractors, yet none have evidence strong enough to silence the others. The absence of proof, paradoxically, is what sustains the legend. If a grave had been found, if a record uncovered, the story might have ended. Instead, we are left with gaps, and in gaps, imagination thrives. And so, more than a century later, the faceless soldier lingers as unresolved myth. He's the man without a face, but also the man without an answer. His story circles endlessly, between theories non-conclusive, all haunting. In him the lines blur, man or monster, patient or phantom, accident or design. Perhaps he was each of these at different times, or perhaps he was none. Perhaps the truth died with him, if indeed he ever died at all. Or perhaps it still walks, faceless, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to look upon it and decide what they see. The faceless soldier of Moscow endures not as a man, but as a question. More than a century has passed since whispers first spread through snow-laden streets of a figure wrapped in bandages, a survivor whose return unsettled not only families but entire institutions. Doctors sought to frame him as a medical anomaly. Priests thundered that he was a punishment from God, and psychologists dissected him as a case of fractured identity. Yet none could truly claim him, for every attempt at explanation dissolved against the silence of his presence. His story is not written in ink and paper alone, but in the fragments of testimony, the rumors that refuse to fade, and the contradictions that still haunt the archives of Moscow. Some insist he perished quietly, perhaps, in a forgotten ward of an asylum, his body lowered into an unmarked grave. Others argue he was seen long after his supposed death, wandering alleys, lingering in doorways, his bandaged form unchanged, untouched by time. To these believers, he is not merely a man, but an eternal shadow, cursed to walk so long as the questions of guilt and war remain unanswered. And yet skeptics argue with equal conviction that he was only ever a victim of injury and hysteria, magnified by a society hungry for the supernatural. The power of his legend lies not in what is known, but in what is not. Was he simply a soldier who returned too broken for the world to accept? Was his facelessness the cruel work of shrapnel and fire? Or was it the absence of identity itself, erased by forces beyond comprehension? Every theory leaves gaps, and into those gaps step fear, belief, and imagination. For each explanation offered, there lingers a contradiction strong enough to keep the mystery alive. What chills us most is not what he did, but what he represented. He was not a murderer, not a tyrant, not a criminal in the ordinary sense. He was presence without identity, existence without recognition. In him, people saw reflections of their deepest anxieties, the loss of humanity in war, the silence of God in times of suffering, the fragility of the self when stripped of familiar form. He was tragedy and omen at once, a man whose very survival threatened to unravel the boundary between flesh and myth. Perhaps the truth was buried with him, or perhaps it still walks, faceless, waiting in alleys where lamps flicker and shadows stretch unnaturally long. The question remains open, deliberately so. Was he man, monster, or mirror? Was he victim, vessel, or curse? What do you believe? Was the faceless soldier merely a broken human returned from war? Or was he a specter of something darker, something that refuses even now to release its hold on our imagination?